Now, let's begin. Wilson Floyd had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only dignity a man could afford. He kept that lesson close as he stood in his small kitchen, watching his son Chris hunched over textbooks at their second-hand dining table, the teenager's pen moving with the kind of focused precision Wilson had seen in master craftsmen. The apartment wasn't much, two bedrooms in a building where the radiator clanged like church bells and the neighbors' arguments bled through walls thin as paper. But it was theirs. Every stick of furniture, every clean dish, every moment of peace had been earned through Wilson's 60-hour weeks at the construction company and Chris's quiet determination to be more than their circumstances suggested he could be. "You should take a break," Wilson said, pulling 2 Cokes from the refrigerator. The luxury of name-brand soda was something he allowed himself once a week, usually on Fridays when Chris stayed up late studying. Chris looked up, pushing wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. At 16, he had Wilson's strong jaw and dark hair, but he'd inherited his mother's gray eyes that held more wisdom than most grown men. Wilson knew. "I'm almost done with this problem set. Dr. Patel said the calculus final is weighted heavily." Wilson set the Coke beside his son's notebook, glancing at the equations that might as well have been hieroglyphics. He dropped out of high school at 17 when his own father had died, leaving him to support his mother and younger brother. Mathematics had never been his language. Concrete, lumber, measurements he could see and touch those he understood. "Your Uncle Maurice called today," Wilson said, the words tasting bitter. "Invited us to Christmas dinner at their place in Westchester." Chris's pen paused. The boy was smart enough to hear everything his father hadn't said. "Do we have to go?" "Your grandmother asked specifically. Said she hasn't seen you since summer." Wilson took a long drink, the carbonation burning his throat. "She's getting older, Chris. Can't say no to her." The truth was more complicated. Wilson's mother, Mary Ann Floyd, had never forgiven him for what she called throwing his life away. Dropping out, working construction, marrying a waitress he'd met at a diner, and getting her pregnant at 20, these were failures in her eyes. Meanwhile, Maurice had done everything right. Harvard Law, partnership at a Manhattan firm by 35, marriage to Regina Whitman, whose family had old money and older connections. That Maurice was technically Wilson's half-brother sharing a mother, but not a father had somehow made the comparison sharper. Maurice's father had been a college professor, a man of letters and prestige who died when Maurice was 10. Wilson's father had been a factory foreman, a good man who taught Wilson the value of hard work before a heart attack took him at 43. "I'll go," Chris said quietly. "For Grandma." Wilson ruffled his son's hair, feeling the familiar swell of pride and protectiveness. Chris never complained. Not about the small apartment, not about wearing thrift store clothes, not about being the scholarship kid at a school full of trust fund teenagers. He just kept his head down and worked harder than anyone Wilson had ever known. "You're a good kid," Wilson said. "Better than I deserve." "That's not true." Chris met his father's eyes. "You gave up everything for me after Mom left." The divorce had been 5 years ago. When Chris was 11, Sarah had decided she wanted more than a construction worker husband and a life of budgeting every dollar. Last Wilson heard, she was in California with a real estate developer, sending birthday cards twice a year and guilt money that Wilson put directly into Chris's college fund without touching. "I didn't give up anything that mattered," Wilson said. "Now finish that problem set. I'm ordering pizza." As he pulled out his phone to call Sal's Pizzeria, the cheap place, not the good place, Wilson tried to ignore the knot of dread forming in his stomach. Christmas with Maurice was always a performance, a carefully staged production designed to highlight everything Wilson wasn't. But this year felt different. Maybe it was the letter that had arrived last week, the one Chris had hidden under his mattress thinking Wilson wouldn't notice. The Harvard crest on the envelope had been visible from across the room. Wilson hadn't said anything. If Chris was applying to Harvard, he had his reasons. And if Chris was hiding it, he probably didn't want to get anyone's hopes up, including his own. The kid had learned that lesson early. Hope carefully, dream quietly, and never let anyone see you want something you might not get. The Saturday before Christmas, Wilson took Chris to buy a decent shirt for the dinner. They drove to the outlet mall 40 minutes away, where brand names sold at prices that didn't require a second mortgage. "You don't have to do this," Chris said as they walked past store windows dripping with tinsel and artificial snow. "I have shirts. None that fit." Wilson had noticed his son's wrists sticking out from his sleeves, the way his shoulders had broadened in the past 6 months. Chris was becoming a man, and Wilson could barely keep up with buying clothes that fit the constantly changing frame. Besides, I got overtime this month. Johnson's crew called in sick, so I picked up their hours. Chris's jaw tightened. He hated when Wilson worked extra, hated knowing his father was pushing a body already worn down by years of physical labor. But he didn't argue. They both knew the math. Everything cost money they didn't quite have. In a store that smelled like fake leather and cologne, a sales associate with a name tag reading Terrence approached them with a kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze traveled from Wilson's work boots to his Carhartt jacket, making rapid calculations. "Can I help you gentlemen find something?" The question had edges. "My son needs a shirt," Wilson said evenly. "Something nice, buttoned down." "Of course. Our dress shirts start at $75. Wilson felt Chris tense beside him. $75 for a single shirt was groceries for a week, but he kept his expression neutral. "Show us what you've got." They settled on a blue Oxford for $40 on sale, marked down because of a tiny stain on the inside of the collar that no one would ever see. Chris tried it on in the dressing room, and when he emerged, Wilson felt his throat tighten. His son looked like he belonged in those college brochures, the ones with kids sitting under trees discussing philosophy or whatever it was college kids discussed. "You look good," Wilson said simply. "Thanks, Dad." As they walked to the register, Chris suddenly said, "Uncle Maurice's kids are going to be there, right? Julian and Christy." "Yeah. They go to Exeter, the boarding school." Wilson heard the subtext. Julian and Christy Douglas attended one of the most prestigious prep schools in the country, where tuition cost more than Wilson made in a year. They were Maurice's proof of concept, his living trophies. "And you're going to public school in Yonkers," Wilson said. "So what?" "So, nothing." But Chris's fingers played with the hem of his new shirt. "Just making conversation." Wilson paid for the shirt in cash, counting out bills while Terrence watched with barely concealed impatience. As they left the store, Wilson put a hand on Chris's shoulder. "Listen to me," he said, stopping in the middle of the mall corridor while holiday shoppers streamed around them like water around rocks. "You're smart. Smarter than I ever was, smarter than Maurice with all his fancy degrees. Don't let anyone make you feel less than what you are." Chris nodded, but Wilson could see the doubt lingering. It was hard to believe in yourself when the world kept telling you a different story. That night, after Chris had gone to bed, Wilson sat in the living room with a beer and the letter he'd finally allowed himself to retrieve from under Chris's mattress. The envelope was still sealed. He held it up to the light, as if he could divine its contents through the expensive paper. Harvard University, Office of Admissions. Wilson remembered being Chris's age, remembered the guidance counselor telling him he had potential, that he should think about community college. He laughed it off. College was for other people, people whose parents could afford it, people who didn't have families counting on them. He'd made his choice and never regretted it. But Chris was different. Chris had options, or at least he might. Wilson carefully put the letter back where he'd found it and finished his beer in the dark apartment, listening to the radiator clang its discordant song. 2 days before Christmas, Maurice called again. Wilson was on a job site, hammer in hand, when his phone buzzed. "Wilson, I need to confirm numbers for dinner." Maurice's voice had that particular tone, the one that managed to sound both jovial and condescending. "You're bringing Chris, yes? Regina's planning the seating. We'll be there." "Excellent. And Wilson, try to arrive on time, would you? We're eating at 6 sharp. I know punctuality isn't your strong suit, but Regina's hired a chef and the timing is crucial." Wilson's grip tightened on his phone. "We'll be on time." Good, good. "Oh, and tell Chris to bring his report card. Mother asked about his grades, and you know how she loves to compare the children's progress." Julian made Dean's List again at Exeter. Christy's being recruited by the Yale field hockey team. Quite the family of overachievers, aren't we? The line went dead before Wilson could respond. He stood there, phone in hand, while his crew boss Bradley called out asking if he was taking lunch or working through. "Working through," Wilson called back, shoving his phone in his pocket and picking up his hammer with enough force to drive a nail through concrete. That evening, he found Chris at the kitchen table again, always at that table, always working. But tonight the textbooks were closed. and Chris was staring at a piece of paper, a computer printout from the school library. "What's that?" Wilson asked, though he could read the Harvard crest from where he stood. Chris looked up, and Wilson saw something in his son's face he rarely witnessed: excitement warring with fear. "I applied to Harvard," Chris said in a rush. "I know I should have told you, but I didn't want. The application fee was waived because of our income, and Dr. Patel wrote me a recommendation. And there was this recruitment program for high-achieving students from underrepresented backgrounds." "Chris." Wilson sat down across from his son. "Breathe." The boy took a shaky breath. "Someone from admissions is supposed to contact me. About an interview or maybe campus visit. I don't know. The letter said they'd be in touch around the holidays." He paused. "I haven't told anyone. Not even Grandma." "Good," Wilson said. "Keep it that way. Especially at dinner on Christmas. You're not mad?" "Why would I be mad? You're going after what you want. That's what men do." Wilson reached across the table and gripped Chris's hand. "But don't count on anything. These schools, they send out thousands of recruitment letters. Doesn't mean you're getting in." "I know." But hope shone in Chris's eyes, dangerous and bright. "And even if you do get in," Wilson continued, hating himself for saying it but needing to, "Harvard costs money we don't have. Scholarships don't cover everything. There's room and board, books, expenses." The letter mentioned financial aid. Full coverage for families making under a certain amount. Chris's voice was steady now, more confident. "I did the research, Dad. I wouldn't have applied if I didn't think we could make it work." Wilson studied his son's face, seeing the determination there, the careful planning. Chris hadn't just dreamed. He'd calculated. He'd made a strategy. That was Wilson's boy, practical, even in hoping. "Okay," Wilson said. "Then we'll see what happens. But at dinner, you let Maurice run his mouth. You stay quiet. Understood?" "Why do they hate us so much?" Chris asked suddenly. "Uncle Maurice." "Grandma, it's like they're angry that we exist." Wilson leaned back in his chair, considering the question. How did you explain to a 16-year-old the complex mathematics of family resentment? How Maurice had grown up with a father who read him philosophy and taught him chess, while Wilson's father had taught him how to patch drywall and change oil. How their mother had mourned her first husband's sophistication and merely tolerated her second husband's blue-collar competence. "Your grandmother wanted a certain kind of life," Wilson finally said. "She got it with Maurice's father. With my dad, she got something different. Not bad, just different. And Maurice, he grew up knowing he was special. Smart, successful. Then I came along, just existing. And it reminded everyone that life doesn't always go according to plan. That's not your fault." "No. But people don't always care about fault. They care about the story they tell themselves." Wilson stood, joints creaking from the day's work. "Get some sleep. 2 more days. And we'll get through this dinner. We've survived worse." But as Wilson lay in his own bed that night, staring at ceiling cracks he'd been meaning to patch for months, he wondered if that was true. They'd survived poverty, survived Sarah leaving, survived the 1,000 small humiliations that came with being the poor relations. But something felt different this year. Maurice's voice on the phone had carried an extra edge of smugness. The dinner invitation felt less like an obligation and more like a setup. Wilson had worked construction long enough to recognize when a structure was unstable, when the foundation had weaknesses waiting to crack under pressure. Christmas dinner at Maurice's house felt like that, a beautiful facade hiding rot. He just didn't know yet where the rot was, or how bad the collapse would be when it finally came. Christmas Eve morning arrived with fresh snow and the kind of cold that crept through window frames and under doors. Wilson woke early, as he always did, his body trained to construction site hours even on days off. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the city wake up under its white blanket. Chris emerged around 8, already showered and dressed in old jeans and a sweatshirt. "Morning," he mumbled, making a beeline for the coffee pot. "Since when do you drink coffee?" "Since finals week." Dr. Patel's calculus exam was brutal. Chris poured a cup and added enough milk and sugar to make it barely recognizable as coffee. He sat at the table, wrapping his hands around the mug. "Dad, about tomorrow, if you're going to ask if we can skip it, the answer's still no." "I wasn't." Chris stared into his mug. "I was going to ask if you think I'm stupid." The question hit Wilson like a fist to the gut. He set down his own coffee and moved to sit across from his son. Where is this coming from? Last time we visited, Uncle Maurice made some comment about how I was probably going to end up in construction like you. He said it laughing, like it was a joke, but Grandma laughed too. And Christy whispered something to Julian, and they both looked at me like Chris's voice trailed off. Wilson felt rage building in his chest, hot and familiar. This was what Maurice did. He smiled and joked and made comments that cut deep while maintaining plausible deniability. He was too smart to be overtly cruel, too sophisticated. The wounds he inflicted were precision cuts. Surgical, in their placement. You're not stupid, Wilson said, keeping his voice level. You're the smartest person I know. Smarter than Maurice, definitely smarter than his spoiled kids who've had every advantage handed to them. But I go to public school. I don't have SAT tutors or college counselors. And you're still competing with those kids on their level. Better than their level. Wilson leaned forward. Chris, listen to me. Maurice measures worth in degrees and money and zip codes. That's his yardstick. But there are other ways to measure a person. Kindness, integrity, hard work. By those measures, you're already twice the man he'll ever be. Chris nodded slowly, but Wilson could see the words hadn't quite penetrated. How could they? When you were 16 and the whole world seemed designed to tell you that you weren't enough, a father's reassurance was just noise against the roar. Tomorrow night, Wilson said, I need you to do something for me. What? Keep your head up. Don't let Maurice see that he's gotten to you. Can you do that? I can try. That's all I'm asking. They spent the rest of the day in quiet preparation. Wilson cleaned the apartment, even though no one would see it. Chris wrapped the modest gifts they'd gotten for Marianne and Maurice's family. A scarf for Marianne, wine for Maurice and Regina, books for Julian and Christy that Chris had picked out himself, researching their interests online with a thoroughness he applied to everything. That night, Wilson couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Chris's question, do you think I'm stupid? The idea that his brilliant, dedicated son could doubt himself because of Maurice's casual cruelty made Wilson want to drive to Westchester right now and put his fist through his half-brother's perfect teeth. But violence was easy. Violence was what people expected from men like Wilson, rough, uneducated, barely civilized. He learned long ago that the best revenge against people like Maurice was success, not sinking to their level, being better than they expected. The problem was, success took time, and humiliation happened in an instant. At some point past midnight, Wilson finally drifted off, dreaming of crumbling foundations and buildings that collapsed in slow motion, all while Maurice stood watching with that smug smile, untouched by the destruction around him. When his alarm went off at 6, Wilson woke with a sense of foreboding he couldn't shake. Today was Christmas. Tonight was dinner. And something in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive on construction sites, that warned him when a structure was about to fail, told him that this Christmas would be different from all the others. He just didn't know if the difference would break them or make them stronger. Either way, there was no backing out now. The drive to Westchester took 90 minutes through Christmas afternoon traffic, Wilson's beat-up Ford pickup threading between luxury SUVs and sports cars as they got closer to Maurice's neighborhood. Chris sat in the passenger seat, wearing his new blue shirt and the tie Wilson had taught him to knot that morning. The kid looked good, nervous, but good. Remember, Wilson said as they turned onto a street lined with houses that cost more than Wilson would earn in 10 lifetimes. We eat dinner, we're polite, we leave. 2 hours. Tops. 2 hours. Chris's fingers drummed against his knee, a nervous habit. I can do 2 hours. Maurice's house appeared at the end of a cul-de-sac, a colonial revival that screamed old money even though Maurice had only bought it 5 years ago. The circular driveway held 3 cars. Maurice's Mercedes, Regina's BMW, and a black Audi that Wilson didn't recognize. Whose car? Chris asked. No idea. Wilson parked his truck on the street, unwilling to let it sit next to Maurice's vehicles like a poor relation. Which, he supposed, it was. The front door opened before they reached it, and Regina appeared in a dress that probably cost more than Wilson's truck. She was all sharp angles and sharper smiles, blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Wilson, Chris, Merry Christmas. The words were correct, but her tone suggested she was greeting encyclopedia salesman. Everyone's in the living room. Maurice is just finishing a work call. Of course, he was. Maurice was always just finishing a work call, always in demand, always so terribly important. The house's interior was exactly what Wilson expected. Hardwood floors, expensive art, furniture that looked uncomfortable because it was designed to be looked at rather than sat on. Through an archway, Wilson could see the living room where his mother sat in an armchair, glass of wine already in hand. Julian and Christy sprawled on a couch, both on their phones. And there, by the fireplace, stood Maurice. He'd put on weight since Wilson last saw him, the kind of prosperous thickness that came from expensive meals and gym memberships that never quite got used. His suit was immaculate, his smile practiced. When he saw Wilson and Chris, his expression shifted into something that might have been warmth if you didn't know better. "Brother!" Maurice came forward, arms spread. He hugged Wilson briefly, the kind of hug designed to be seen rather than felt, then turned to Chris. "And my brilliant nephew. Look at you, all grown up." Chris managed a smile. "Hi, Uncle Maurice. Getting tall. Still. What are you now? 5'10"? Julian here is 6'1". Good genes on his mother's side." Maurice clapped Chris on the shoulder, and Wilson saw his son flinch slightly. "How's school? Still, at that public school in Yonkers?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Good. Nothing wrong with public education. Builds character." Maurice's smile widened. Julian and Christy just finished their semester at Exeter. Both made honor roll. Christy got recruited by Yale for field hockey. "Did I mention that?" "Once or twice," Wilson said dryly. "Wilson." His mother's voice cut through the room. Marian Floyd had aged well, maintained by expensive creams and a life free from physical labor. She extended one hand, and Wilson crossed to kiss her cheek. "You're late. We're 10 minutes early, Mom." "Exactly. I taught you to arrive 15 minutes early to any engagement. But I suppose punctuality is another lesson that didn't take." She turned her attention to Chris, and her expression softened slightly. "Christopher, let me look at you." Chris stood still while his grandmother examined him like a painting of questionable provenance. "You need a haircut," she finally declared. "And you're too thin. Don't they feed you?" "I feed him fine," Wilson said, fighting to keep his voice even. "I'm sure you do your best." The words were dismissive. "Maurice, get your brother a drink. Lord knows he'll need it to survive Regina's experimental cuisine." "Mother, the chef I hired is a cordon bleu graduate," Regina started. "Yes, dear. I'm sure everything will be wonderful." Marianne took a long sip of her wine. Maurice steered Wilson toward a bar cart that held liquor Wilson couldn't afford and wouldn't drink if he could. "Scotch? I've got a 20-year Macallan. Beer's fine if you have it." "Of course. I keep the common stuff for the caterers." Maurice pulled a domestic beer from a mini fridge hidden in an antique cabinet. "So, how's the construction business?" "Still swinging hammers. Pays the bills." "Barely, I imagine." Maurice poured himself 3 fingers of scotch. "You know, I could get you on at my firm. Not as a lawyer, obviously, but we always need security personnel. It'd be steadier than construction, better benefits." The offer was pure Maurice, designed to sound generous while highlighting Wilson's lower station. Security personnel. Glorified door guard. "I'm good where I am," Wilson said. "Suit yourself. But the offer stands. I take care of family, unlike some people." Maurice's eyes flicked toward their mother. Some old wound that Wilson didn't fully understand. Before Wilson could respond, a voice came from the hallway. "I apologize for my tardiness. I got caught up reading some of Julian's papers. Quite impressive work." A woman entered the living room, and Wilson felt his stomach drop. She was in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, with steel gray hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. She carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. "Ah, Dr. Nichols." Maurice moved forward quickly. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Dr. Sherry Nichols. She's with Harvard's undergraduate admissions office. She's been kind enough to join us for Christmas dinner to discuss Julian's application." Wilson's eyes snapped to Chris, who had gone pale. Dr. Sherry Nichols. Harvard admissions. The woman who had sent Chris the recruitment letter. And Maurice had invited her here to talk about Julian. "Dr. Nichols, this is my family," Maurice continued, oblivious to the bomb he'd just detonated. My mother, Mary Ann. My wife, Regina. My children, Julian and Christy. And this is my half-brother Wilson and his son Christopher. Doctor. Nichols's gaze swept the room, pausing fractionally longer on Chris than the others. Pleased to meet you all. Thank you for including me in your celebration. Any friend of Julian's is welcome, Mary Ann said, already 3 glasses deep and showing it. Tell us, Doctor, what do you think of our grandson's chances? I'm afraid I can't discuss individual applications, Dr. Nichols said smoothly. But I'm always happy to speak generally about what Harvard looks for in candidates. Of course. Professional ethics and all that. Maurice gestured everyone toward the dining room. Shall we eat? Regina's planned quite the feast. The dining room table could have seated 12 comfortably. It was set with china that probably cost more than Wilson's monthly rent, crystal that caught the light from an enormous chandelier. Place cards indicated where everyone should sit. Maurice and Regina at the heads of the table, Mary Ann to Maurice's right, Dr. Nichols to his left, Julian and Christy flanking their grandmother. And at the far end, as distant from the center of power as possible, Wilson and Chris side by side. Wilson had expected this. Maurice arranged everything in his life, including seating charts, to reflect his personal hierarchy. What he hadn't expected was for Chris to freeze in the doorway, staring at Dr. Nichols with something like horror. Chris, Wilson said quietly. You okay? She's here, Chris whispered. She's the one who Dad. She doesn't know I know. It's fine. We'll deal with it. But it wasn't fine. Wilson could see the trap closing, even if he didn't understand yet how Maurice had said it. His half-brother hadn't accidentally invited a Harvard admissions officer to dinner. Maurice never did anything accidentally. They took their seats. Actual hired servers in crisp white shirts began bringing out courses: butternut squash soup, winter salad with candied pecans. Conversations swirled around topics Wilson had no entry point for: European vacations, charity galas, people with hyphenated last names. Dr. Nichols, Wilson noticed, said little. She watched. She listened. Her sharp eyes tracked the conversational flow, noting dynamics. It wasn't until the main course rack of lamb that probably cost more than Wilson's weekly grocery budget that Maurice made his move. So, Dr. Nichols, he said, cutting into his lamb with surgical precision. I have to ask, what's your opinion on legacy admissions? Julian here is a 4th-generation Harvard candidate. My father went there. I went there. Regina's father went there. Does that count for anything anymore? Legacy is one factor among many, Dr. Nichols said carefully. We look at the whole candidate, of course. But between 2 equally qualified candidates, one legacy, one not, surely family tradition matters. Maurice, Regina said quietly, a warning note in her voice. But Maurice was warming to his theme, his voice getting louder as the scotch flowed. I mean, Julian has everything. Perfect SATs, captain of the debate team, straight A's at Exeter. He's practically a shoo-in, right? No candidate is a shoo-in, Dr. Nichols said. Harvard rejects thousands of perfect candidates every year. But surely not legacies with Julian's credentials. Maurice looked around the table, seeking affirmation. Mother, remember when I got my acceptance letter? That was a special day. It was, Mary Ann said, smiling at the memory. You were destined for great things, Maurice. And Julian follows in your footsteps. Julian, Wilson noticed, looked uncomfortable. The kid wasn't a bad sort, just sheltered and overprivileged. He kept his eyes on his plate, clearly wishing his father would stop talking. Now, my nephew Christopher here, Maurice said, and Wilson's entire body tensed. He's a different story. Public school in Yonkers. No SAT prep, no extracurriculars to speak of, right, Chris? Chris's voice was barely audible. I'm in the math club. Math club? How quaint. Maurice's laugh was loud. Too loud. See, Dr. Nichols, this is why education matters. Opportunities. Resources. Christopher's a smart boy, I'm sure, but he'll probably end up in construction like his father. Some people just aren't cut out for elite institutions. The room had gone very quiet. Even the servers had stopped moving. Wilson started to stand, ready to take Chris and leave. To hell with Christmas dinner. But then he felt a hand on his arm. Chris was looking at him, shaking his head slightly. "It's fine, Dad," he said quietly. "It's not fine." "Wilson, don't be so sensitive," Maurice said. "I'm simply stating facts." "Christopher, I'm not insulting you. I'm being realistic. You seem like a hard-working kid, and there's honor in that. But Harvard?" He laughed again. "Come on, let's be serious." "Maurice, that's enough," Regina said, her voice sharp. But Maurice was drunk now, the scotch and his own sense of superiority combining into something ugly. He stood, raising his glass. A toast to Julian, future Harvard man, following in his father's distinguished footsteps. Julian looked miserable. Christy was staring at her lap. Regina's face had gone white, and Dr. Nichols was watching everything with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Maurice moved around the table, glass in hand, until he stood behind Chris. He put his hand on Chris's shoulder, gripping hard enough that Wilson saw his son wince. "This," Maurice announced to the room, "is why education matters. My nephew here is proof that stupid runs in families." Wilson was halfway out of his chair when Marianne laughed. Actually laughed. She raised her own glass in agreement. The sound of his mother's laughter was like acid in Wilson's veins. This was his family. This was what they thought of his son, of him, of everything he'd built from nothing. Maurice was still talking, still squeezing Chris's shoulder. Now, don't look so glum, Christopher. Someone has to flip burgers and pour concrete, right? Not everyone can be special. Mr. Douglas." Dr. Nichols's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I think that's quite enough." Maurice turned, surprised. He'd forgotten she was there, or perhaps assumed she'd find his performance as amusing as he did. Dr. Nichols stood slowly. She wasn't tall, but she commanded the space. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, she said. "I've interviewed thousands of students. I've read tens of thousands of applications. And I've learned to recognize certain things." She walked around the table until she stood in front of Chris. "Christopher Floyd, correct?" Chris nodded, unable to speak. "I thought I recognized the name. You submitted an early application to Harvard, didn't you?" The room was absolutely silent now. "Yes, ma'am," Chris whispered. Dr. Nichols smiled. It was a cold smile. The smile of someone who was about to enjoy what came next very much indeed. "I reviewed your application myself last week," she said. "Your essay on applying mathematical modeling to climate change prediction was exceptional. Your recommendations from your teachers were glowing. And your test scores, despite having no formal SAT prep, were in the 99th percentile." Maurice's face had lost all color. "In fact," Dr. Nichols continued, "I came to New York specifically to meet you, Christopher. I was planning to contact you after the holidays. But since I'm here," she turned to face Maurice, "I'm pleased to inform you, in front of your family, that you've been accepted to Harvard University's class of 2030, full scholarship. All expenses paid." The silence that followed was absolute. Wilson felt tears sting his eyes. He reached for Chris's hand under the table and squeezed it. Dr. Nichols wasn't done. She turned back to Maurice, and now her smile was razor-sharp. "As for Julian," she said, "I'm afraid his application was denied. We found his essay derivative and his recommendations, while positive, suggested a student who has been given every advantage but shown minimal initiative. We have limited spots, Mr. Douglas. We give them to students who've earned them." Maurice's wine glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the expensive hardwood floor. "Merry Christmas," Dr. Nichols said pleasantly. "Thank you for dinner. I'll see myself out." She left through the front door, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Chris started laughing. It was a quiet sound at first, almost shocked, but it built into something real and joyful and completely uninhibited. Wilson joined him, unable to help himself. They laughed together while Maurice stood frozen, while Regina covered her face with her hands, while Marianne's wine glass dangled from her fingers, while Julian and Christy looked anywhere but at their father. "I think," Wilson said, standing and helping Chris to his feet, "we should go." "Yeah," Chris said, grinning wider than Wilson had ever seen. "Yeah, we should." They walked out together, leaving the wreckage of Christmas dinner behind them. As they reached Wilson's truck, Chris turned and hugged his father hard. "Did that really just happen?" Chris asked. "Yeah," Wilson said, his own voice shaking with laughter and something deeper. Yeah, it really did. They drove home through the snowy night, Christmas music playing on the radio, both of them still processing what had occurred. But somewhere on the highway back to Yonkers, Wilson felt his earlier laughter fade into something colder. Dr. Nichols had exposed Maurice in the most perfect way possible. The man had been destroyed by the very arena in which he'd claimed superiority. But Wilson knew his half-brother. This wasn't over. Maurice didn't accept humiliation. He retaliated, and Wilson needed to be ready. "Dad," Chris said as they pulled into their apartment complex. "What happens now?" Wilson looked at his son, his brilliant, amazing son who was going to Harvard, who had earned everything the universe was about to give him. "Now," Wilson said, "now we make sure Maurice can never hurt you again." The week after Christmas passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. Harvard's official acceptance letter arrived, accompanied by a financial aid package that made Wilson's hands shake as he read it. Not just tuition covered everything. Room, board, books, a living stipend. Chris would want for nothing. "This is real," Chris kept saying, staring at the Harvard crest on the letterhead. "This is actually real. It's real," Wilson confirmed, feeling a pride so intense it was almost painful. But alongside the pride was a gnawing worry. Maurice hadn't called, hadn't texted. Complete silence from Westchester, which was somehow more concerning than rage would have been. On New Year's Eve, Wilson was doing inventory at the construction site, thankless work that someone had to do when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. "This is Wilson. Mr. Floyd. This is Nathan Patel. I'm Chris's calculus teacher." Wilson straightened. Alarm bells ringing. "Is Chris okay?" "Chris is fine. Excellent. Actually, I wanted to congratulate you personally on his Harvard acceptance. It's a remarkable achievement, Doctor." Patel paused. "But I'm calling about something else. I received a rather unusual inquiry today from someone claiming to be conducting a background check on Chris for Harvard." Wilson's blood went cold. What kind of background check? They were asking about Chris's academic integrity, whether I'd ever suspected him of cheating, whether his test scores seemed improbable given his background. "Doctor," Patel's voice was careful, "I found the questions offensive, frankly. I told them that Chris is one of the most brilliant and ethical students I've had in 20 years of teaching." "Who was asking these questions?" "They said they were from a private investigation firm, Rutherford Associates. They claimed Harvard hired them to verify all scholarship recipients." Wilson's jaw clenched. "Did you give them a name? Who you spoke with?" "A man named Byron Harrington." "Mr. Floyd, I don't want to alarm you, but I called Harvard's admissions office afterward. They don't use private investigators. This inquiry was not legitimate." After he hung up, Wilson sat in his truck and let rage wash over him in waves. Maurice. It had to be Maurice. Trying to destroy Chris's acceptance, to claim it was based on fraud or deception. Wilson had construction skills, not investigative ones, but he knew someone who might help. Jesse Bailey had worked security before moving into construction management. They'd been on the same crew for 5 years, and Wilson trusted him more than most. When Wilson called and explained the situation, Jesse was quiet for a long moment. "You want me to look into this Rutherford Associates? I want to know who hired them and what they're trying to do to my kid. Give me 2 days." Jesse called back in one. "Your brother's got a hard-on for ruining Chris's life," Jesse said bluntly. "Rutherford Associates is a legit firm, but they'll do dirty work if the money's right. Maurice hired them to investigate Chris's academic record, looking for any hint of impropriety. Cheating, plagiarism, fake recommendations, anything that would void his Harvard acceptance." "He won't find anything," Wilson said. "Chris is clean. I know that. You know that. But that might not matter. These guys are good at making smoke where there's no fire. They can manufacture doubt, get the school administration questioning things. Even if it all gets cleared up eventually, it could delay Chris's enrollment or damage his reputation." Wilson's knuckles were white on the phone. "What do I do? Honestly, fight fire with fire. You need leverage on Maurice. Something that makes him back off or risk his own destruction. I'm not an investigator, Jesse. I don't know how to dig up dirt. Maybe you don't need to dig. Maybe it's already visible if you know where to look." Jesse paused. "Your brother's a lawyer, right? High-powered firm? There's always something shady in those circles. Tax evasion, ethical violations, extramarital affairs, something. Wilson thought of Maurice's perfect life. His perfect house, his perfect image. How do I find it? Start with what you know. Who are his enemies? Who has he screwed over? Every successful man has bodies buried somewhere. After hanging up, Wilson sat in the dark apartment while Chris studied at the dining table, oblivious to the war being waged around him. Wilson had spent his whole life avoiding confrontation with Maurice, taking the high road, being the bigger man. But this wasn't about him anymore. This was about protecting his son, which meant it was time to fight dirty. The next morning, Wilson drove to Manhattan. Maurice's law firm occupied 3 floors of a building in Midtown, all glass and steel and wealth. Wilson felt out of place in his work jacket and boots, but he'd learned long ago that confidence mattered more than appearance. He found a coffee shop across the street and settled in to watch. He had no plan, just the vague sense that if he observed long enough, he might see something useful. 3 hours and 4 overpriced coffees later, he saw Maurice emerge with another man. They walked to a restaurant 2 blocks away, and Wilson followed at a distance. Through the restaurant window, he watched Maurice and his companion, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit, engaged in what looked like an intense conversation. Maurice was animated, gesturing, clearly agitated about something. Wilson took a photo with his phone, then sent it to Jesse. Any idea who this is? 20 minutes later, Clinton Glenn, federal prosecutor, Southern District of New York. He and your brother were law school classmates. A federal prosecutor, having lunch with Maurice, looking serious. Wilson's investigative instincts were basically non-existent, but even he could sense this was important. He spent the next week becoming a part-time stalker, tracking Maurice's movements during lunch hours and after work. He saw the same pattern, Maurice meeting with Clinton Glenn at discreet locations, always looking tense, always checking over his shoulder. Something's wrong in Maurice's life, Wilson told Jesse. I don't know what, but he's scared. Then find out what he's scared of, Jesse said. That's your leverage. Wilson wasn't sure how to do that until opportunity fell into his lap in the form of Julian Douglas. The kid showed up at Wilson's apartment on a Tuesday evening, looking miserable and desperate. Uncle Wilson, Julian said when Wilson opened the door. I need to talk to you. Please. It's about my dad. Wilson, let him in. Chris emerged from his room, surprised to see his cousin. What's going on? Julian? Wilson asked. The kid was 18, on the verge of adulthood, but still young enough to look lost. Dad's been losing it since Christmas. He's barely sleeping. He's paranoid, thinks people are watching him, and he keeps having these closed-door meetings with lawyers. Not his work colleagues, different lawyers. Criminal defense attorneys. Wilson and Chris exchanged glances. Why are you telling me this? Wilson asked. Because Mom's scared. She won't say it, but I can tell. And Christy's been crying. And Dad, Julian's voice cracked. Dad keeps saying it's Chris's fault. That if Chris hadn't applied to Harvard, none of this would be happening. He blames your family for ruining everything. Julian, Wilson said carefully. Do you have any idea what your father might be afraid of? What he might have done? The kid shook his head. I don't know. But last night, I heard him on the phone with someone. He said something about, if the Southern District starts digging, everything falls apart. What's the Southern District? Federal prosecutors. Wilson said grimly. Julian looked even more scared. Is my dad going to prison? Wilson wanted to say no, to offer comfort. But he'd learned not to make promises he couldn't keep. I don't know, kid. But if he is, it's because of choices he made, not because of Chris. After Julian left, Wilson and Chris sat in silence for a long moment. Dad, Chris finally said, what are you going to do? Wilson considered the question. The smart move would be to do nothing. Let Maurice's crimes, whatever they were, catch up with him naturally. But that might not be enough to stop the investigation into Chris, and it wouldn't satisfy the burning need for justice that had been building in Wilson's chest since Christmas dinner. No. If Maurice was going down, Wilson wanted to help push him over the edge. I'm going to make a phone call, Wilson said. He pulled out the business card he'd been carrying since his coffee shop surveillance had led him to take a chance. He'd approached one of Maurice's firm's paralegals as they left the building, claimed to be a potential client, and charmed the name of Maurice's biggest professional rival out of her. The name on the card read, James Rhodes Partner, Sterling and Rhodes LLP. Wilson made the call. James Rhodes met Wilson at a bar in Queens, far from the Manhattan power corridors where lawyers like him usually operated. He was younger than Wilson expected, mid-40s, with the hungry look of someone still climbing. "You said you had information about Maurice Douglas," Rhodes said without preamble. "I'm listening." "First, I need to know something," Wilson said. "Why do you care? What's Maurice to you?" Rhodes smiled without humor. 3 years ago, Maurice stole a client from me. Not just any client, a pharmaceutical company worth millions in billing. He did it through methods that weren't exactly ethical. Poached my associates, accessed privileged communications. I couldn't prove it, but I know it happened. So, this is revenge. No, this is justice. There's a difference. Rhodes leaned forward. Maurice Douglas is a shark in a tank full of sharks. But he's gotten sloppy, greedy, and when sharks get greedy, they make mistakes. Now, what do you know? Wilson told him about the meetings with Clinton Glenn, about Maurice's paranoia, about the references to the Southern District. Rhodes listened intently, then pulled out his phone and made a call. "It's James Rhodes. I need background on a current SDNY investigation. Maurice Douglas of Douglas and Partners." "Yes, I'll hold." 3 minutes later, Rhodes hung up with a grin that made him look predatory. "Your brother's in deep trouble. The Southern District is investigating his firm for fraud. Specifically, billing fraud. They've been overbilling clients for years, charging for work never done, inflating hours, creating phantom expenses. It's a systemic problem, and Maurice is right at the center." "How do you know this?" "I have friends who talk. The investigation's been quiet, but it's ramping up. They're going to start issuing subpoenas soon." Rhodes studied Wilson. "But you already knew something was wrong. Why come to me?" "Because I want to make sure Maurice goes down hard," Wilson said. "And I want to make sure it happens before he can hurt my son." Rhodes's smile widened. "I think we can help each other. I have documents evidence of Maurice's client theft that I couldn't use before because I obtained them through questionable means. But if those documents happen to surface as part of a federal investigation, they'd be admissible. Explosive, even. What do you need from me?" "Access to Maurice. To his office, his files, his computer. Can you get that?" Wilson thought about it. "Maybe. Through my nephew Julian." The kid's scared and looking for answers. "If I frame it right, he might help." "Then do it. Because Maurice is trying to destroy your son's future. You owe him nothing but payback." Wilson knew it was wrong. Knew he was crossing lines he'd never crossed before. But when he thought of Chris's face at that Christmas dinner, of Maurice's hand on his shoulder, of that crushing humiliation. "I'll make it happen," Wilson said. 3 days later, Julian Douglas walked into his father's home office at 2 a.m. and copied the contents of Maurice's personal laptop onto a flash drive. He handed it to Wilson the next morning, hands shaking. "Is this going to destroy Dad?" Julian asked. "Probably," Wilson said honestly. "Can you live with that?" Julian thought about it. "He's been destroying other people my whole life. Maybe it's time someone stopped him." The kid had more backbone than Wilson had given him credit for. Wilson gave the flash drive to James Rhodes, who gave it to his contacts at the Southern District. Wilson didn't know exactly what was on it, didn't want to know. But 2 weeks later, federal agents executed a search warrant on Douglas and Partners. Maurice was arrested at his office on 17 counts of wire fraud, billing fraud, and conspiracy. The news hit every legal publication in New York. Wilson watched the coverage from his apartment, Chris beside him on the couch. "You did this," Chris said. "It wasn't a question." "I helped," Wilson admitted. "Maurice was already guilty. I just sped up the timeline." "Why?" "Because he tried to destroy your Harvard acceptance. Because he spent his whole life making us feel small. Because he needed to learn that actions have consequences." Chris was quiet for a long moment. "I should probably feel bad about this." "But you don't." "No," Chris said. "I really don't." The trial lasted 3 months. James Rhodes fed Wilson updates Maurice's bail hearing, his lawyer's desperate motions, the mounting evidence. The firm collapsed. Partners fled. Clients sued. Maurice's perfect life crumbled like a building with no foundation. Regina filed for divorce. Marianne stopped taking Maurice's calls. Julian and Christy moved in with Regina's parents, trying to salvage what remained of their college prospects. And through it all, Wilson watched from a distance, feeling neither guilt nor satisfaction, just a grim sense that the universe had finally balanced its scales. The day Maurice was sentenced 7 years in federal prison, Wilson took Chris out for pizza. Not the cheap place, the good place. Harvard orientation is in 2 weeks, Wilson said, eating a slice that actually tasted like real food instead of cardboard. You nervous? Terrified, Chris admitted, but good terrified. Like I'm about to start something big. You are. Wilson raised his soda. To new beginnings. Chris clinked his glass against Wilson's. To justice. That too. They ate in comfortable silence. 2 men who'd fought their way through hell and come out stronger. Wilson knew there would be more battles ahead. College would be hard. The world would be hard. But Chris had proven he could handle whatever came his way. And Wilson had proven he could protect his son, no matter what it took. Even if it meant becoming someone he'd never planned to be. 8 months later. Wilson stood in Harvard Yard, surrounded by parents whose cars cost more than his annual income. Freshman move-in day had transformed the campus into chaos. Students hauling boxes, parents offering advice, everyone looking slightly overwhelmed. Chris emerged from his dorm building, sweating from the effort of carrying furniture up 3 flights of stairs. Last box, he announced. My roommate seems cool. He's from California, wants to study astrophysics. Astrophysics, Wilson repeated. That's like space stuff? Yeah, Dad. Space stuff. Chris grinned. You okay? You've been quiet all morning. Wilson looked around at the historic buildings, the manicured lawns, the bronze statues of men who'd changed the world. This place wasn't built for people like him. But it was built for people like Chris, smart, determined, willing to work harder than anyone else. I'm good, Wilson said. Just thinking about how far you've come. We've come, Chris corrected. You're the one who made this possible. I just kept the roof over our heads. You did everything else. They stood together in the yard, father and son, watching the privileged masses swirl around them. Wilson spotted a few parents he recognized from television actors, politicians, CEOs. Old money and new money, legacies and donors. People for whom Harvard was a continuation of a family tradition. And then there was Chris, first in their family to attend college. Here on pure merit and nothing else. Your grandmother called yesterday, Wilson said casually. Wanted to apologize. Said she was wrong about you. That she's proud. What did you say? I told her she could talk to you directly if she wanted. Gave her your email. Chris nodded slowly. I might respond. Eventually. But I'm not in a hurry. That's your call. They were interrupted by a familiar voice. Christopher Floyd? Wilson turned to see Dr. Sherry Nichols approaching, a warm smile on her face. Dr. Nichols, Chris said, standing straighter. I didn't expect to see you here. I like to greet our new students personally when I can. She shook Chris's hand, then Wilson's. Mr. Floyd, it's good to see you both under happier circumstances. Thank you, Wilson said. For everything. What you did at that dinner. I simply spoke the truth. Dr. Nichols's expression hardened slightly. What your brother said that night was unconscionable. I've been doing this job long enough to recognize talent when I see it, regardless of background. Christopher earned his place here. Still, Wilson said, you didn't have to make it so public. Dr. Nichols smiled. Perhaps not. But some moments call for a certain dramatic flair. She turned back to Chris. I expect great things from you, Christopher. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here. You've already proven you belong anywhere you choose to be. After she left, Chris said, I really like her. She's got style, Wilson agreed. They finished moving Chris's belongings. Then Wilson took his son to dinner at a restaurant near campus. Nothing too fancy. Chris would need to learn to budget for 4 years of meals. And Wilson wanted to make sure he understood the value of money, even with the financial aid covering most expenses. Over burgers and fries, Chris said, I heard from Julian last week. Wilson looked up, surprised. Yeah? How's he doing? Better. He got into Boston University. Not Harvard, but still a good school. He said his mom's getting remarried, some architect who treats them well, and Christy's probably going to play field hockey at a Division II school. What about Maurice? Julian visits him once a month at the prison upstate. Says Dad's different now. Quieter. Broken. Kind of. Chris pushed fries around his plate. Julian asked me if I felt guilty. About what happened. What did you tell him? I said I felt sorry for him and Christy, because they didn't deserve to lose their father. But I don't feel guilty about Maurice facing consequences for his own actions. Wilson nodded approval. That's a mature way to look at it. Did you feel guilty? About helping to bring him down? It was a question Wilson had asked himself many times in the past months. He'd crossed ethical lines, manipulated his nephew, conspired with Maurice's rivals. In another context, people might call him vengeful, ruthless, no better than Maurice himself. But when he thought about that Christmas dinner, about Maurice's hand on Chris's shoulder, about the casual cruelty of suggesting his son was proof that stupid runs in families. No, Wilson said honestly, I don't feel guilty at all. Maurice spent his whole life punching down at people he considered beneath him. Someone needed to punch back. I'm just glad I was strong enough to do it. Chris studied his father's face. You're different now. Harder. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just finally willing to fight for what matters. Wilson reached across the table and gripped Chris's hand. You matter. Your future matters. And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat to protect that. They finished dinner and walked back to the dorm. At the entrance, Wilson pulled his son into a hug. I'm proud of you, Wilson said. So damn proud. I know. Dad, I'm proud of you too. They separated, and Wilson watched Chris walk into the building, into his future, into the life he'd earned through brilliance and determination and sheer stubborn refusal to be less than he was. On the drive back to Yonkers, Wilson's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him. This is Wilson. Mr. Floyd, this is Regina Douglas, Maurice's ex-wife. Wilson pulled over, suddenly alert. What can I do for you, Regina? I wanted to thank you. Her voice was quiet, but firm. I know you played a role in Maurice's downfall. My lawyers discovered the connection to James Rhodes, the timing of everything. I'm not stupid. I didn't. Please. Don't insult me by denying it. She paused. Maurice was abusive. Not physically, but emotionally. He made me feel worthless unless I was perfect. He made our children feel like failures if they weren't the best at everything. I stayed because I thought that's what you did. You stayed, you endured, you maintained appearances. Wilson listened, unsure where this was going. But when he went to prison, when everything fell apart, I finally felt like I could breathe, Regina continued. The kids and I went to therapy. We talked about things we'd never discussed, and we realized we're better off without him. So thank you for giving us a chance to escape. The line went dead. Wilson sat in his truck on the side of the highway, processing this unexpected absolution. He'd set out to protect Chris and punish Maurice. He hadn't considered that there might be other victims grateful for Maurice's downfall. Maybe justice was more complicated than he'd thought. 4 years passed. Chris thrived at Harvard. He made Dean's List every semester, joined research groups, published papers, summer internships at tech companies and research labs. Friendships with students from all over the world. A girlfriend his junior year, though that didn't last past graduation. Wilson visited campus 4 times a year, always feeling out of place, but always welcomed by his son. He met Chris's friends, attended parents' weekends, listened to lectures he didn't fully understand, but enjoyed anyway. The construction work got harder as Wilson's body aged, but he kept at it, saved money where he could. Started taking online classes at community college accounting, because numbers were concrete and knowable, and he liked the idea of understanding them better. Maurice served 5 years of his 7-year sentence, released early for good behavior. He moved to Florida, took a job at a small firm doing contract review work. No longer a partner, no longer prestigious, just another lawyer grinding through document review. He never contacted Wilson or Chris, never apologized, simply disappeared into the kind of ordinary life he'd once mocked. Marianne reached out to Chris during his sophomore year, tentatively at first, then with increasing warmth. She never fully apologized to Wilson, but she stopped comparing her grandsons, started asking about Chris's studies with genuine interest, even sent money for his birthday. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. Julian graduated from BU and got a job in marketing. He and Chris stayed in touch, cousins who'd found unexpected common ground in surviving their family's dysfunction. Christy played field hockey at a small college in Vermont and seemed happy, posting pictures on social media of mountain hikes and friends. And then, on a May afternoon in Chris's senior year, Wilson got a call that changed everything again. "Dad, are you sitting down?" Wilson was actually up on scaffolding, but he climbed down at the tension in Chris's voice. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Dad, I got into MIT's PhD program. Full ride. They want me to research quantum computing applications." Wilson felt tears spring to his eyes, something that happened more easily these days. "Chris, that's incredible. But that's not even the best part." Chris's voice was shaking with excitement. "I also got job offers. 3 of them, tech companies. Dad, the lowest offer is $200,000 a year." Wilson actually sat down on a pile of lumber, his legs suddenly weak. 200,000? Starting salary. With bonuses and stock options, it could be more. Chris laughed, the sound almost disbelieving. "I keep looking at the numbers thinking there's a mistake, but it's real. I could take one of these jobs, work for a few years, pay off any debt, help you out." "Don't you dare," Wilson said fiercely. "You take that PhD program. You keep learning, keep growing. The money will be there when you're done, but you've sacrificed so much. And watching you succeed is my reward." "Chris, I'm serious. Do the PhD. Become Dr. Christopher Floyd. Make discoveries that change the world. That's what I want for you." They talked for another hour, Chris describing the research opportunities, the faculty he'd work with, the possibilities. Wilson listened with a pride so overwhelming it was almost painful. That night, alone in his apartment, Chris would be home for the summer in 2 weeks. Wilson poured himself a scotch. Not the cheap stuff he usually drank, but a bottle he'd been saving. 20-year Macallan, the same brand Maurice had offered him that Christmas night. He'd bought it after Maurice's sentencing, thinking he'd drink it when justice was served, but he'd never opened it. The revenge, when it came, had felt hollow. Necessary, but hollow. Now he had something worth celebrating. He raised his glass to the empty room. "To Chris," he said aloud, "who proved that stupid doesn't run in families. Excellence does." The scotch burned smooth and perfect on his tongue. Chris's Harvard graduation was on a Thursday in late May, under blue skies that seemed impossibly perfect. Wilson wore a suit, the first suit he'd owned since his wedding, bought specially for this occasion. He sat in the crowd of thousands, watching his son walk across the stage to receive his diploma. Christopher Floyd, Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics, summa cum laude. The applause was just polite noise until Wilson stood and cheered loud enough to embarrass his son and himself, and he didn't care at all. After the ceremony, Chris found him in the crowd, grinning in his cap and gown. "Did you have to yell that loud?" "Yes," Wilson said, hugging him hard. "Yes, I did." They took photos, hundreds of photos. Chris with his diploma, Chris with Wilson, Chris with friends and professors. Dr. Nichols appeared at one point, shaking Chris's hand and congratulating him warmly. "He was everything I thought he'd be," she told Wilson. "And more. He's pretty special," Wilson agreed. Later, at a restaurant where Wilson had made reservations 6 months in advance, they sat across from each other and ordered steaks they didn't need to worry about affording. 5 years ago, Chris said, cutting into his ribeye, "We were eating pizza and wondering if I'd survive my first semester. Now, I'm about to start a PhD at MIT. You've earned every bit of it." "We've earned it," Chris corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Wilson thought about the past 5 years. The late-night phone calls when Chris was stressed about exams. The care packages Wilson sent, filled with homemade cookies and encouraging notes. The visits to campus where they'd walk around, and Chris would talk about his classes, and Wilson would just listen, proud and slightly baffled by his son's brilliance. "You would have found a way," Wilson said. "You're too stubborn not to. I get that from you." They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then Chris said, "I saw something weird yesterday. On campus." "Yeah." Maurice was there. At graduation. Just standing at the edge of the crowd, watching. Wilson's hand tightened on his fork. "Did he approach you?" "No. He just watched for a while, then left." He looked. Chris searched for the word. Old. Tired. Like life had beaten him down. "It did," Wilson said. "He beat himself down. We just helped." "Do you ever regret it?" "What we did to him?" Wilson considered the question. Did he regret conspiring with James Rhodes, manipulating Julian, setting in motion events that destroyed Maurice's life. Did he regret crossing ethical lines he'd never thought he'd cross? No, he said finally. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that Maurice forced my hand. But I don't regret protecting you. Chris nodded slowly. I looked into it, you know. After I realized what you'd done, the investigation was already happening when you got involved. Maurice was already committing fraud. You just accelerated the timeline. Does that make it better? I think it makes it justice rather than revenge. Chris met his father's eyes. Maurice spent his whole life believing that success came from crushing others, from being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else. You showed him that real strength isn't about tearing people down. It's about building them up. When did you get so wise? I had a good teacher. They finished dinner and walked through Cambridge, the city alive with celebrating graduates and proud parents. Wilson watched his son tall now, confident, ready to take on the world, and felt something settle in his chest. A sense of completion. He'd done his job. He'd raised a good man. Everything else was just details. What are you going to do now? Chris asked as they walked. You've been working construction for 25 years. Ever think about doing something else? Like what? I don't know. You've been taking those accounting classes. Maybe get your degree? You're only 45. You've got time to start a second career. Wilson had thought about it. Thought about what it would be like to work in an office instead of on a construction site. To come home without his body aching. To use his mind instead of his hands. Maybe, he said, maybe I will. I could help pay for it. Once I start making real money. No. Wilson stopped walking and turned to face his son. Chris, listen to me. Your money is yours. Build your life. Save for your future. Enjoy your success. I'll figure out my own path. But you sacrificed everything for me. I sacrificed nothing I didn't want to sacrifice. And seeing you graduate from Harvard, watching you become the man you are, that's payment enough for 1,000 lifetimes. Chris's eyes were wet. I love you, Dad. I love you too, kid. They hugged there on the Cambridge sidewalk. Two men who'd fought their way through poverty and prejudice and family dysfunction to get to this moment. And in that hug, Wilson felt the weight of the past 5 years finally lift. They'd won. Not just against Maurice, but against every low expectation, every limitation, every person who'd ever suggested that Chris Floyd wasn't good enough. They proved them all wrong. And that, Wilson thought, was the sweetest victory of all. 2 years into Chris's PhD program, Wilson walked across a different stage in a different cap and gown. Community college graduation, associate's degree in accounting. Not Harvard, not prestigious, but earned through night classes and weekend studying, and the same stubborn determination he taught his son. Chris was there, cheering just as loudly as Wilson had cheered for him. After the ceremony, they went to the same pizza place they'd celebrated at when Chris got his Harvard acceptance. Full circle. So what now? Chris asked. Job hunting? Already got a job, Wilson said. Small accounting firm in Yonkers. They liked that I was older, had real-world experience. Starting Monday. Dad, that's amazing. It's entry-level. Pays less than construction. At least at first. Wilson shrugged. But my back doesn't hurt at the end of the day. That's worth something. They ate pizza and talked about Chris's research, about his girlfriend Sarah, who was also at MIT studying neuroscience, about the paper he was co-authoring with his advisor. I'm buying a condo, Chris said casually. In Somerville, close to campus. The company stock I got from that summer internship is finally vested. And I can use it for a down payment. Wilson felt his throat tighten. His son was buying property, building equity, creating stability, all the things Wilson had never quite managed. That's great, Chris. Really great. You should come visit once I'm settled in. There's a second bedroom. You could stay whenever you want. I'd like that. They finished eating and walked to Wilson's truck, still the same beat-up Ford, though he'd had to replace the transmission twice. As Wilson unlocked the door, Chris said, I heard from Julian yesterday. Maurice got remarried. Some woman he met at his law firm in Florida. They're expecting a baby. Wilson processed this. Maurice, starting over, building a new life far from the ruins of his old one. How do you feel about that? Wilson asked. Honestly, I hope he's different with this kid than he was with Julian and Christy. I hope he learned something. Chris paused. But I'm not holding my breath. Good. Don't waste energy on him. I don't. I barely think about him anymore. Chris smiled. Though I did get a message from him last month. Through Julian. He wanted to congratulate me on the PhD program. What did you say? Nothing. I didn't respond. What could I say? Thanks for being such a terrible person that I had to work twice as hard to prove I wasn't like you. Wilson laughed despite himself. That would have been honest. They stood by the truck, neither quite ready to leave. Finally, Chris said, "You know what the best part of all this is? It's not the degree or the research or the money. It's knowing that I don't have to be afraid anymore. Of being poor, of being looked down on, of not measuring up. I proved I measure up. We proved it." "We did," Wilson agreed. "And Maurice is in Florida doing contract review, and we're here, living our lives, being happy." Chris's smile was fierce. "That's the real victory, isn't it? Not destroying him, but building ourselves up so high that he couldn't touch us even if he tried." Wilson pulled his son into one last hug. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," Chris said again. Wilson drove home through the city he'd lived in his entire life. Past streets he knew by heart, past the construction sites where he'd spent decades of his life. He felt lighter than he had in years. Justice had been served, not just in Maurice's prison sentence, but in Chris's success, in Wilson's new career, in the life they'd built from nothing. Some people measured victory in dollars or titles or prestigious universities. Wilson measured it in the smile on his son's face, in the knowledge that Christopher Floyd would never have to feel less than anyone ever again. And by that measure, they hadn't just won. They'd achieved something close to perfection. 5 years after Chris's Harvard graduation, Wilson sat in the audience at MIT's doctoral hooding ceremony. Dr. Christopher Floyd, PhD in computer science, specializing in quantum computing. The dissertation had been titled Novel Approaches to Quantum Error Correction Using Topological Codes, words that meant nothing to Wilson, but everything to the future of technology, apparently. Chris had already accepted a position at a research institute in California. Starting salary, $300,000 a year, plus equity in a startup spin-off he'd helped found. Wilson was 50 now, a senior accountant at a firm that had grown to appreciate his work ethic and practical approach. He'd never make the kind of money Chris was making, but he was comfortable. More than comfortable. For the first time in his life, money wasn't a constant worry. After the ceremony, at dinner with Chris and Sarah, who was now Dr. Sarah Chin, newly graduated with her own PhD in neuroscience, Wilson raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, "and to old foundations," Chris added, looking at his father. "Because you can't build high without a solid base." They drank, and Wilson felt the familiar swell of pride. His son, Dr. Floyd. Brilliant, successful, kind, and most importantly happy. Later, walking through MIT's campus, one last time before Chris moved to California, they passed a group of prospective students on a campus tour. The guide was explaining MIT's commitment to need-blind admissions, to supporting talented students regardless of financial background. One kid, a teenager who reminded Wilson painfully of Chris at 16, asked timidly, "But what if you're from a bad school district? What if you don't have the same preparation as rich kids?" The tour guide smiled. "That's why we look at what you've done with what you've had. Someone who excels despite obstacles is more impressive than someone who excels because of advantages." Chris and Wilson exchanged glances. "True then, true now," Chris murmured. "Always will be," Wilson agreed. That night, Wilson's phone rang. Unknown Florida number. He answered hesitantly. "Wilson." Maurice's voice was older, rougher, but unmistakable. "I hope it's okay that I called. Julian gave me your number." Wilson's first instinct was to hang up, but curiosity won. "What do you want, Maurice?" "I wanted to congratulate Chris on his PhD. I saw the announcement online." A pause, and "I wanted to apologize for everything." Wilson walked out onto his apartment balcony, looking over the city lights. "Little late for that, don't you think?" "Yes, probably, but I've had a lot of time to think. In prison, in therapy after, about who I was, what I did." Maurice's voice cracked slightly. "I was cruel to you, and Chris. I was cruel to my own kids. I built my entire life on making other people feel small, so I could feel big. And now I'm nobody, just another lawyer at a small firm." But I have a daughter. She's 3. And when I look at her, I think about Julian and Christy, about how I made them feel like they were never good enough. He took a shaky breath. I don't want to be that person anymore. Wilson listened, trying to find anger and finding only weariness. I'm glad you're trying to change, Maurice. I really am. But that doesn't undo the damage you did. I know. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just, I wanted you to know that you were right. About everything. And I'm sorry. The line went dead. Wilson stood on his balcony for a long time, processing the conversation. An apology didn't erase the past, didn't undo Christmas dinner, or the investigation into Chris, or the years of subtle and not so subtle cruelty. But it was something. He called Chris. Maurice just called me, Wilson said. Apologized. How do you feel about that? Chris asked. I don't know. Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell. Part of me thinks maybe people can change. They can, Chris said. Whether they do is another question. But Dad, here's the thing, it doesn't matter. We don't need his apology. We don't need his approval. We never did. No, Wilson agreed. We never did. We won because we built something better. Not by destroying him, but by being better than he could ever imagine. Wilson smiled. When did you get so wise? Chris laughed. I had a good teacher. After they hung up, Wilson went back inside and pulled out a box from his closet. Inside were mementos from the past decade. Chris's high school graduation program, his Harvard acceptance letter, newspaper clippings about Maurice's trial, photographs from MIT. He added the program from today's hooding ceremony to the collection. This was their story, not a story about revenge or bringing down enemies. A story about a father and son who refused to be limited by other people's expectations, who worked harder than anyone thought possible, who proved that intelligence and determination mattered more than privilege or connections. Maurice was just a footnote in that story. A villain who got his comeuppance, yes, but ultimately irrelevant to the real narrative. The real story was Wilson Floyd, construction worker turned accountant, who raised a son alone and gave him every opportunity to succeed. And Dr. Christopher Floyd, who took those opportunities and built something extraordinary. Everything else was just noise. Wilson closed the box and put it back in the closet. Tomorrow, he'd go to work. He'd review spreadsheets and prepare tax returns and help small business owners navigate financial regulations. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work that used his mind and paid the bills. And in California, Chris would start his new job, doing research that might change the world. They'd both come so far from that Christmas dinner 10 years ago. From that moment of humiliation that had sparked everything that followed. Maurice had meant to crush them, to prove they were less than, to maintain his position at the top of the family hierarchy. Instead, he'd given them fuel, motivation, a reason to prove him wrong in the most spectacular way possible. And they had. God, how they had. Wilson turned off the lights and went to bed, sleeping the deep, dreamless sleep of a man at peace with the choices he'd made and the life he'd built. In the morning, he'd wake up and keep building. Because that's what Floyd men did. They built. They persevered. They won. And they never, ever let anyone tell them they weren't good enough. Not anymore. Not ever again. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.